NCAA tournament has been canceled.
Basketball courts left empty.
This decision is based on the evolving COVID-19 public health threat.
Stories with chapters left unwritten.
Chioza.
Experiences and opportunities lost.
Just think about how many people, how many universities this impacts.
We've waited. We've been resilient. And now we're back. $1,020 student athletes, 67 games, 6 venues, all in one place. In 49 states, it's just basketball. But this is Indiana. It's time to make history with the game we love. Heartbreaking losses, Cinderella stories,
The dream is alive.
buzzer beaters.
Puts it up.
68 teams, one dream. Championships, confetti, nets, trophies. Let's dance.
Hello everybody, and welcome to the first ever Final Four Talks. My name is Neelay Bhatt, and I'm the curator for the event. Before we go any further, I want to acknowledge the day today. April 4th, 1968, right here in Indianapolis, at an urban park at the intersection of Broadway and 17th. A gentleman led by these words, "I have some very sad news for you." That was Robert F. Kennedy breaking the news of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. His words and the way he led that day with an impromptu, impassioned speech with love, compassion, and humanity changed the trajectory of what could have been in the city that night. So before we go further, I would love for us to watch that, and then we'll proceed.
For those of you who are Black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to get beyond or go beyond these rather difficult times. My favorite poem, my favorite poet was Aeschylus. He once wrote, "Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black. I turn home to say a prayer for the family of Martin Luther King. Yeah, it's true. But more importantly, to say a prayer for our own country, which all of us love. A prayer for understanding and that compassion of which I spoke. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks and white amongst whites, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that is spread across our land with an effort to understand compassion and love. We can do well in this country. We will have difficult times. We've had difficult times in the past, but we will have difficult times in the future. It is not the end of violence. It is not the end of lawlessness, and it's not the end of disorder. But the vast majority of white people and the vast majority of black people in this country want to live together, want to improve the quality of our life, and want justice for all human beings that abide in our land. And what dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. Let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and for our people. Thank you very much.
Wow. What powerful words. What we need is not division or hatred. What we need is love and compassion and wisdom. It is these words that averted a crisis and any violence in Indianapolis the day when riots broke out throughout the entire country. Indianapolis stayed calm. That's the power of words when used for good. They can make a dent in the universe, they can affect change, they can inspire and empower people for good. And that is what this event today is about. Final Four Talks, a racially just future, looking to share ideas and inspire you all to act. But before we go there, I want to acknowledge also how hard a year we have all had. From canceling the men's Final Four last year to where we are now, in the grand scheme of things, that's a minor thing when compared to the lives lost, the jobs lost, the change in everything we thought was normal. But what this little occasion, this last month has given us is hope, is something to look forward to, some memories to create, some occasions to celebrate. Also, shout out to my Ohio University Bobcats beating the defending champions. Sorry, Virginia. But that's where the world is now. We're trying to see the light at the end of the tunnel, and this would not have happened without all the people behind the scenes for this. Shout out to the NCAA, and especially here the hometown team with Indianapolis as well. A huge thank you to all of you. Without you, none of this would happen, and for that we will always be grateful. So, as we kick off this inaugural Final Four Talks, we have an incredible lineup of speakers for all of you. From Turkey to Tokyo, from LA to Louisiana, we have spoken word artists and sports psychologists. We have athletes and activists and advocates and allies, all here to share the common thread of ideas that can make an impact. Along with the speakers too, as a part of the legacy of this event and giving back, we're acknowledging and supporting 4 local nonprofits with donations as well. All four of them have continued to play an impact in the city, not just in the last 1 year through the pandemic, but in the years past as well. The 100 Black Men of Indianapolis, Catch the Stars Foundation with Tamika and Taja Catchings, the Immigrant Welcome Center, and Grassroots Projects, which works to empower immigrant children that are especially under-resourced. All four of these nonprofits will be the beneficiaries of the event. Be sure to check them out during the breaks, support them, support the mission, and help us make the world a better place for all of us to live in. So, to kick us off today, we have none other than local spoken word artist and poet, Manon Voice. Please have a virtual applause for Manon, and let's start the event today. Sit back, take in the ideas, and be inspired to act upon it wherever you are. Thank you all.
The neon numbers on the shot clock glare. The press of time thickens the arena with angst. The count drawing downward, like the sweat beads that line the rim of foreheads and crawl these walls. On the way into these doors are the halls that boast the memorabilia of crimson conquest, championships held fast in the embittered glass box wide for witness. Timeless monuments of pride to remind us of our place in this game, where here we have gathered again and again, filing in our positions of spectators, commentators, and players, referees, and trainers, many of whom dedicate this game to a soundtrack of lofty ideals, crossing their hearts with their hands, while others kneel on an outstanding promissory note still yet to be fulfilled. Those with the ticketed stamps of privilege and power, courtside in Ray-Bans, all eyes glance to see the tip-off, contender against champion, their color brandished on their backs, for which we have been socialized to cheer or sneer, according to the pages from an old playbook that has been socially engineered, where the rules have been rigged in the favor of only one home team who reigns supreme, and all else are just others. Bodies scrambling in the paint, entangled ankles, toes against toes, shoulder against shoulder of the formidable foe. And from these sit-ins and stands, we have seen pass after pass up of justice, brick after brick of crumbling liberty, block after block out of rebound attempts at diversity, equity, inclusion, drop balls in the ruthless courts of no mercy, foul shots, foul shots, foul shots from those who are paid to guard the game, protected in the no-charge zone, where their carrying offenses are justified and then overthrown. When the crowd protests, the victims are offered free throws of money to settle their reticence until the next offense. Those lost, engraved in the marquees of history, these names of martyrdom we clad ourselves in like retired jerseys. How many numbers now? These plays propagated through our political and personal media outlets, replayed and reshared as the highlights of our blood sport. Printed publications give us the terminology of our defeat, and although we are wiser at the game, we still keep getting beat. Time after time, we began again from the baseline, pleading for impartiality, told that progress is slow. Just keep pressing. Keep your eyes on these field goals. You've come a long way from the plantation, a long way from your foreign nation. Come on, keep trying to cross over. Maybe someday you'll gain possession. And although we are too many first too late, a win from the underdog always poses the grave threat that will cause this tired game to erupt in an upset. And yet, the times we have tried to exit, to build our defenses, our Black Wall Streets have been burned so that we can stay tethered to this system. So they keep franchising the struggle for their own benefit, like those who profit off the building of more prisons. And now look, we are doing overtime. The neon numbers on the scoreboard glare. The press of time thickens the arena with angst. The count drawing downward. There are no more quarters left in this game. How will you go down in the Hall of Fame?
I want you to picture a red swing set, okay? So when I was about 13 years old, I remember sitting in my parents' backyard on a red swing set, praying out loud for my legs to grow back. I was tired. I was tired of chasing my friends around town on my prosthetic legs or in my wheelchair. I was tired of sitting alone at the hockey rink, up in the bleachers, looking down at the ice, watching my friends play hockey without me. Now, this wasn't the first time I had prayed this prayer, not even close. But it was the last time. Something changed. To explain that, I should probably go back a little bit. I wasn't born with a disability. I grew up in a big family in a small town up in Canada, and I had what seemed like a pretty normal childhood. As a kid, I loved any sport I could get my hands on, but as a Canadian kid, I was raised on hockey. And I didn't so much love hockey as crave it. I mean, I needed hockey. When I was 9 years old, I was hit by a car, and I lost both my legs below the knees. And in losing my legs, I lost my independence, I lost sports, I lost hockey. It was a really hard time. Mercifully, though, just a year later, I was introduced to wheelchair basketball at a summer sports camp. And I remember that day very vividly. We were outside having lunch. It was a sunny day. We were in this parking lot and we went inside. So we went from the bright outdoors right into this dark gym. And it took a few moments for my eyes to adjust. When they finally did, I saw basketballs lying on the court and a little mini basketball hoop. And so I leaned over in my wheelchair and I picked up a basketball and I put it on my lap and I wheeled over the basket and I took a shot. And I went in. So I grabbed the ball and I did a little loop and I went in and hit another shot. And then I took that Batman hat and flipped it around backwards, did a big loop, picked up some speed, came in, hit a layup. I mean, that was it. I was hooked. I would describe the feeling to you, but it was kind of indescribable. I felt light, I felt free. And so you think that's it. This kid's a baller now. He's off to the races. His Paralympic journey has begun. Well, it wasn't quite that simple. Because for a long while anyway, I couldn't give up on that hockey dream. And so I got fitted for prosthetic legs. And I slowly, painfully learned how to walk again. But I'll be honest with you, I didn't care about walking. I wanted to run. I wanted to jump. Most of all, I wanted to skate and play hockey. I couldn't do it though. I tried and I failed over and over again. And if the feeling of playing wheelchair basketball was like the weight of my accident finally lifting, the feeling of skating on prosthetic legs was just the opposite. It's like a burden. And so that brings us back to that red swing set and that prayer. And, here I was, this kid who loved wheelchair basketball, who was doing great. And yet, I would have given up wheelchair basketball in a second to have my legs back. Just wasn't ready to accept my story. And then something happened, something amazing, something pivotal. And it started with me doing something that I'd never done before. I wore my prosthetic legs to wheelchair basketball practice. So I came into the gym, I took my coat off on the sideline, and I wheeled onto the court wearing my prosthetic legs. And I grabbed a ball and I started to warm up. And this surprised everyone, including my coach, Jeff, who wheeled over to me and he pulled me aside away from the other kids and he said, "Pat, the legs are awesome. I'm really happy for you. But listen, out here on the basketball court, those legs are only going to weigh you down. You have a gift. You have long arms and short legs. It's the perfect combination for wheelchair basketball. Long arms make you tall, short legs make you fast." And then he said, "It's your choice, of course. But if I were you, I'd lose the legs. And it was like scales fell from my eyes, and I saw myself the way that Jeff saw me, the way that I really was. I wasn't an injured hockey player. I was a perfectly healthy wheelchair basketball player. I was whole. I was complete. I may have been missing my legs, but I had everything I needed to be a great athlete, to be a future Paralympian even, Paralympic gold medalist. That conversation with Jeff, it didn't change my circumstances, but it did something maybe even more powerful. It changed my perspective. And so I stopped praying for my legs to grow back. Yes, they would be nice to have, even now, but I don't need them. I finally hopped off that red swing set. I jumped in my basketball chair, and I kept wheeling forward. And within a couple of years, I won the World Junior Championships with Team Canada. And then I left that small town for the University of Illinois on a wheelchair basketball scholarship. And then I made the men's national team. And we went on to reach the podium at 4 consecutive Paralympics. Gold, gold, silver, and gold again. So yeah, we won all the things. And I think one reason we were able to do that and go on such a long run was that as a program, as a team, we stayed hungry and we stayed curious. We were always wondering, can we get better? Can we repeat? And eventually it became, can we change the game? And it was like once our potential was unlocked, that potential was like a bird escaping from a cage and it just took off. And we said, let's go chase that thing. Let's work so we can find out where our potential might lead us. And to a great extent, we were able to do that. And I think that's often how great teams sustain excellence. Curiosity, lifelong curiosity. And you know what? It's a habit worth nurturing, not only because it helps you and will serve you well on the court, it'll serve you well off the court too. So yeah, I've had a lot of success since that swing set, but you know what? I still struggle. I still find myself distracted by what I can't do instead of focused on what I can do. And I'll give you a recent example. About a year ago, we had just won silver at the Para-Pan Am Games, which meant we had qualified for the Tokyo Paralympics 2020. So we're about to hit the home stretch towards Tokyo, and I was feeling great. I was playing well. I was in great shape. And then the pandemic hit and lockdown. And like you, like everyone else, my plans were suspended and I was at home, locked out of my gym, couldn't train. I got really stuck. And so one day I'm on my phone scrolling through Instagram and I come across this post from LeBron. And it was video of LeBron working out at home in his home gym, in his multi-million-dollar Los Angeles home. And I looked up and I looked around my New York City apartment that I share with my wife and 3 kids, and I saw a medicine ball and some exercise bands and a spike ball set. And then I looked back down at my phone, and guess what? I was right back in the red swing set. Envious, distracted by all the things that LeBron can do and I can't do, which is a lot of things, by the way. In this moment, though, when I was down, my wife came along and she gave me a huge assist. She said, well, what can you do? What do you have to work with? And she looked around her apartment and she saw that same med ball and that same spike ball set, and she designed some workouts. And so we put a show on for the kids and we shut the door and we got to work and we did these workouts together, and she got me moving again and got me training, got me unstuck. Here's what I want to say. You can be that person, that leader, that teammate, that coach who finds ways to steer the conversation towards those kinds of questions. What can we do? What do we have to work with? How can we lean on one another? Now, that doesn't mean we have to accept all of our circumstances. If our circumstances are bad, if they're unfair, if they're unjust, we can and should work towards changing them. But sometimes we can't change them. I couldn't skate anymore. I'd certainly never be able to dunk, but I got an assist from Jeff, and that helped me change my perspective and see my circumstances in a new light, and that gave me hope in a new direction. In big or in small ways, you can do the same for someone. One spin of the wheel, one assist at a time. So my faith tells me that God heard my prayer that day on the red swing set. My suspicion tells me that my earthly father, Vic, my dad, might have heard the prayer as well. Because not too long after that, a load of lumber arrived at our house, and my dad started building a deck in our backyard. And when he was done, the red swing set was gone. And in its place was a basketball hoop. Amen to that. Peace.
Locker room talk. We've all heard and cringed at the typical examples. But what about these? I don't do all of that fluffy, mushy stuff. There's no way I'm telling a stranger my problems. Counseling is for crazy people. I'm tougher than that. Therapy, that's for white people. For so many people, these ideas are commonplace and roll off the tongue as naturally as saying hello. For athletes, the idea of admitting to anything other than a winning, competitive mentality might seem unnatural, and in no way seems to fit with the narrative of what it means to be one. Likewise, the glorification of playing through pain and not asking for help, or viewing admitting to experiencing trauma as a weakness, has made it particularly difficult for athletes and men alike to seek support. So here's what we know. Nearly 1 in 5 adults in the United States live with a mental illness. Of them, 23 million received mental health services in the past year. More women than men sought out and received these services. People of color are 50% less likely to seek mental health care compared to the white population, and Black Americans make up only 8.7% of individuals who receive those services. 75% of lifetime cases of mental health conditions begin by age 24, making the college years and the 25% of students who seek services the most susceptible. Among them, only 10% of college student athletes seek support. The prime fears related to mental health that often plague the athlete experience leave very little room for vulnerability and often make the pedestal feel as if it's in the highest of stratospheres. Combine those fears with media portrayals, social and cultural biases related to communities of color, and the personal baggage that we all carry, the scale of the problem seems to continuously grow, leaving no room for error and an immense need to shift the narrative about what mental health is and what it's not. So what is it? And why is it being talked about so much more in the realm of sport, but continues to be defined so vaguely and still avoided by so many? People often incorrectly define the term mental health and use it interchangeably with mental illness. I like to define mental health as the continuum on which thoughts and emotions exist. These are extremes and midpoints, ups and downs. On one end, the difficulty of things like PTSD, depression, and performance anxiety, and on the other end, optimal health, resilience, and thriving. Correctly defining and scaling mental health in sport in tandem with the personal definitions and narratives of athletes, particularly for male athletes and athletes of color, is only as effective as our willingness to also understand the dynamics and definitions of those identities. Mental health is an essential part of overall health and self-acceptance. It sustains physical health and directly influences athletic performance. When you feel like your best self, you play like your best self. It's that simple. So as an athlete, if I'm not prioritizing my mental health, failing to acknowledge past trauma, not being free to express where I stand on matters of racial and social injustice, seeing help seeking as a deficit of my masculinity or athletic identity, what exactly am I doing? And is what I'm doing truly working for me? I've had the pleasure of working in the field of mental health in some capacity for the last 10 years, and it has been the joy of my life. A career path that I never imagined for myself. It is also one that many members of my family still don't quite understand. I'm really, really proud of the type of work I get to do, but stigma and disparities still exist. However, If I'm really honest, the two things that I'm most proud of are actually responsible for me ending up on this path. That same family and being from New Orleans. I'm a third generation New Orleans, Louisiana native who was raised by my single mother, Amanda, who has been a special education teacher for the last 31 years, and my widowed grandmother, Odile, who worked in housekeeping at Dillard University for 31 years. They're super cute, right? Everything about that experience, which statistically shouldn't have ended with me being here chatting with you today, was necessary and pushed me, as my grandmother, who was only educated up until the 7th grade, would often say, to go as far as I could go. There was a rich legacy around education, and from very early on, I've always been determined to change the narrative related to what it looks like to be someone who is from where I'm from or had a unique family structure like mine, and to be an example of what is possible for students, clinicians, and women alike. A significant turning point in getting to this very moment, though, came during my senior year of high school when Hurricane Katrina ravaged the city of New Orleans. We lost everything we owned and had to instantly let go of everything we knew to be true about what was important to us and what life was supposed to be like. I had to let go of my identity as a volleyball and track athlete, truly understand what it meant to be marginalized because of my race and class, and learn for the first time what the continuum from earlier looks like when mental health is forcibly manifested into your everyday existence. Often, the things we see as deficits are the very things that put us on the path to fulfilling our dreams and our purpose. For me, it was being 17 years old, Black, female, and having to leave sports and life as I knew it behind to shift my perspective, build resilience, and pursue a career in a field that no one in my life fully understood. Studying psychology gave language to that experience and what I was feeling. For many athletes, competing and participating in sport does the same thing. Each experience adds to the journey. Each win or loss is a lesson and an opportunity to grow, to get better at the thing that you know, while also assessing, is it working for you? So here's what we know, and we must be sure to understand. Ultimately, we learn by way of choice or circumstance. Had I let circumstance, Hurricane Katrina, my non-traditional family structure, being from a lower socioeconomic status, or my lack of knowledge about mental health and its benefits determine my path, you wouldn't be able to call this Black, 5'6", pretty mediocre former volleyball and track athlete and woman from the lower 9th Ward of New Orleans, Dr. Poole, and someone speaking to you today. Instead, I chose vulnerability and a new path that put stigma and stereotypes aside. I chose my gifts, my talents. I chose me. I encourage each of you to embrace and own your story as well. First, by sharing it, like so many people are doing with you today. And secondly, by choosing to get assistance along the way. Rid yourself of the shoulds, the things you've been told versus the things you need to fulfill your purpose and calling. On some days, that will look like choosing asking for help versus socialized masculinity, vulnerability versus stigma, going to therapy versus balling out. No matter what circumstance you find yourself in, the choice is about letting go of what you think you know and telling a different story than what's been told. Thank you.
All right. Hello and welcome everybody to this panel discussion with three incredible superstars and storytellers. So, Bilqis, let's start with you. When we discussed as well, you mentioned you were the baby of the family growing up, and just what was that like for you growing up as well? And how did you get into basketball?
I am the youngest of 8. I have 4 sisters and 3 brothers. We were all born Muslims, and basketball was just a part of our culture at that point.
So who were you following and who were you sort of looking up to and playing when you did go out to play at the parks or where you did?
Yeah, so I really started at the age of 5, got my first hoop, but basketball became more than just a hobby when I was around the age of 12. my parents had a very serious conversation with me, and they said, look, we can't afford college. So you're going to have to use either your skill or your academics to figure out a way to get a scholarship to school. I used the basketball as a tool to kind of pave that way to a higher education. And it started in local parks against boys who hated to play against me. I would walk on courts, and at first they would look at me like, no, you're not going to play with us. And then when I got out there, those boys were like, who's going to guard her? They would actually rotate all 5 boys to see who was going to stop me. And so I made a name for myself around the neighborhood.
Kenna, you know a little bit about struggle too, growing up with your mom as a Somali immigrant and, you being one of 3 siblings too. Tell us more about your childhood and what was that like growing up?
Yeah, so my mom came to the U.S. from Somalia around, 30 years ago, and she really imparted a gratitude and a humbleness and, the way I do everything. I was the middle child, so I was kind of forced to have a lot of, independence when I was, once my younger sister was born. And having an older brother, for me was probably the biggest athletic advantage, I ever could have asked for.
There seems to be a little bit of a thread here of, playing in the parks and playing more at the grassroots level. And Jason, that's something you obviously know very well about in your professional world, but tell us about you growing up in Chicago and what was that like for you?
It was really incredible. I grew up in a city called Richton Park, which is south of Chicago. Spent a lot of time on the south side. My mom's family is from Bridgeport, just South Chicago area, and spent a lot of time there in Chicago parks playing a ton of basketball. But it was really a tremendous upbringing, I got to tell you, and exposure to a lot of different opportunities. And I will say through my teen years, especially, a time of absolutely tremendous change in cultures and, all throughout those years.
And you acknowledge a little bit just in terms of growing up with privilege and going to the YMCA and seeing the haves and maybe the haves not, right? As you've experienced, you got to a point with sports as well. And I mean, how did you get into basketball and what was that experience like for you?
Where I grew up, just South Chicago and going to the inner city quite a bit, it's kind of what you did. And unfortunately, there also wasn't a whole lot of other sport options. Well, I say that, but then again, I got, was able to play some really great, basketball opportunities. So it's just kind of what you did. And I just remember, we'd play practically all night by the street lights, and most of the rims were half broken in Chicago, didn't have maybe metal nets standing. And it's kind of how you bonded.
Speaking of opportunities to play, Bilqis, clearly you could ball and no one could guard you, which is great. But you also, getting into your freshman year from a religious standpoint and just, how you were seeing life changed as well. What was that transformation like?
At the age of 15 is when things got a little different for me. My physical appearance changed and I started to wear my hijab. And I was devastated. I was afraid. I thought that life was over when I had to step into this physical role of my faith. And I wasn't forced. I wasn't, demanded to do it, but I knew that my family and I believed in it. So it took me a while to go back to school, to high school, and I was homeschooled previously. So I finally get back to school and it was just, I think I put more pressure, on myself than I needed to. People accepted me. However, personally, I still kind of felt apart. I looked different, but where I felt most comfortable was on the court. And although there were times that I would get taunted, teased, the fan sections would rip me apart. In Springfield, Massachusetts, and the neighboring cities, majority, we played Catholic schools. In a lot of, towns where there weren't a lot of minority. And it was tough, but I used that as fuel to kind of play even harder, score even more points, and make a name for myself. And that soon became into the image that I kind of still hold now as like the first Muslim woman to play basketball in hijab. It sounds great, but it came with a lot of weight.
I can't even begin to imagine that as a teenage girl, right? There's so much emphasis at that age on physical appearance, right? How were you navigating that personally as well, even off the court?
I think that's where the challenge came in. At the age of 15, you're realizing the beautiful parts about yourself and really, as a woman, your hair speaks a lot about you. And I loved my hair. I loved doing it in different styles, you know, and it was something that came with having to cover that up and not feeling beauty or not fitting the standard of beauty. And as women, you know, it's hard because although we shouldn't compete against each other, you also, you know, want to be seen as pretty or as, you know, it's just natural. It's human nature for women. And so when I went through that phase, I had to figure out how to balance that. And again, when you step on the court, you don't worry about those things. So my safe haven was basketball.
Jason, you had very much of an epiphany as well, being on the basketball court in a different lens. And there's a picture just above your left shoulder, which is what first caught my eye when we were talking. And it looked like you were the only. And tell us more about the team. Tell us more about those experiences and what that was like for you.
Yeah, it was a great experience, you know, and it's interesting when folks see that picture, and it's just a really old picture. It just sparks a lot of discussion and why. That was an 8th grade picture, an 8th grade basketball team. I was the only white player at an all-black basketball team, and it was a district team. Frankly, I don't know how I made it, but I did. And I was the only, not only was I the only white player, but I was the only player from my school. The other schools in the area at that time had gone through an incredible change, and a lot of kids moving out from Chicago, mostly black schools. A lot of those bigger teams were in South Chicago. And I would regularly be the only white person in the entire city square block. And it was just very interesting what Bilqis said earlier was that, you know, when you get on the court, it doesn't really matter anymore. When you get on the court, you just want to play. And that's sort of the true equalizer, is actually getting out to play. I'll tell you that, you know, I can't even imagine some of the things that, you know, the other panelists had said. I was mistreated a little bit, but as I said earlier, I always had my sort of bubble of my white neighborhood privilege to go back to.
Kenna, you've had at a similar age and time as well, a very uncomfortable feeling, but for completely different reasons, right? You're getting into boarding school, and at that point, you started becoming more aware about things about yourself.
While I was in boarding school, and a little bit before then, I still cared about basketball incredibly. That's where I focused on my time. But I also knew that I was very different than some of my teammates in a way. And I had this realization in the back of my head that I was gay. And I knew that, you know, this was not something that I could change. When I was even younger in early high school and in middle school, I would, you know, try to date girls, but I knew after a while that was not for me. But I also knew in terms of my safety and my acceptance and even my relationship with my teammates and even possibly coaches, that being gay would probably not have been acceptable, or even if it was, it would have been a very difficult journey. So that kind of, you know, changed my relationship in terms of, you know, while Jason was, you know, aesthetically different than his team in terms of visually, he didn't fit in. I knew that a part of myself also did not fit in, but it was kind of in a more insidious fashion.
Bilqis, how was that for you? You know, there was so much press and coverage, and this novelty, if you would, of here's a girl wearing a hijab that looks completely different from others, and you started getting attention at the high school level and colleges were coming after you. What was that recruitment process like, and how did your parents and you navigate that?
So early on, it started really with uniform when I was a freshman in high school. And at that time, of course, there was no dry fit material. There were no sports hijabs that you can find now. So I was in like a full sweatsuit. So I remember actually going into Dick's Sporting Goods, and we're just searching like, what is the lightest piece of material? So of course we found the thin cotton pants, a thin shirt, but still, I was still burning up on that court. And it was funny because the question that I would often get was like, are you hot in that? And I'm like, duh, I have 5 other layers than you. Of course I'm hot, you know, but honestly, like having that as a hindrance just made me play even harder because a lot of people thought like, you know, question what I wore.
Jason, you've had an interesting trajectory as well in terms of diversity too. Here you are, a white guy growing up on the south side of Chicago, playing with an all-black team. I know you've married a Latina and you have biracial kids. You're like a walking United Nations, basically. What is that experience like for you and your family now? And how have you all been having these conversations around diversity and inclusion and just your family dynamic?
Growing up in my household, it was very natural that we had a very welcoming environment, a very respectful environment, and just appreciate and embrace diversity and learning about different cultures. I do recall the names that I was called in the gymnasiums and how I was treated by different cultures. It made me absolutely sick to my stomach. I'd actually get ill. But you know what? Again, I had to deal with that for 60 minutes, maybe 30 minutes, whatever the case may be. And that appreciation and seeing how that, the lack of respect, the negativity, how hurtful it can be. And I had a taste of that. It's kind of carried me through my profession and what I do for a living as a public servant and just wanting to build community and embrace the richness of diversity.
Kenna, speaking of being judged, you mentioned Thanksgiving with your parents, but then you had to come back with the mask on to a team. And you had a coach that believed in you and supported you as well over your Christmas break. What was that process like when you came out, and how did that change your dynamic with the team and your teammates?
Yeah, so I came out to my coach over Christmas break. So from Thanksgiving to Christmas, I was still closeted to everyone. And I chose him because he really, believed in me as a basketball player. He told me when I got to campus my first year, he thought I could be an All-American at my school. And, just having that bond with him, as a coach and player, I really trusted him. So I came out to him and he was really understanding. And, just from knowing I had his support, it gave me a little bit more confidence. And that spring, after my season had finished, I first came out to two of my friends, the other two Black men on the team. We were all first-year players. And while I don't think either of them were really equipped with the terminology or had really, had many gay friends in the past, let alone, gay athletes, gay teammates, they both were really accepting of me and, did their best to let me know that they had my back.
But as you survey the landscape around you, from the time, your boarding school years to now, what has changed and what hasn't still changed?
I think there's a lot more intention at being inclusive. This was the first year the NCAA even had a queer inclusive award created that specifically acknowledged people from the LGBTQ plus community. So I think there's way more representation in terms of media and in terms of institutional support, but there still is not a current out NBA player, a current out NFL player, a current out MLB player. And, these people exist. So, one way for us to really kind of survey environmentally how safe and how inclusive spaces are to look into these professional leagues. And if no one is coming out, that means that those spaces aren't inherently as inclusive as we probably like to think. And
I know, Bilqis, you faced resistance too coming out of college when you wanted to play as well. And again, with the hijab and the rules FIBA had in place, what were those struggles like for you?
Of course, after reaching that goal of getting a Division I scholarship, my next goal was like, okay, well, I am pretty good. Why not try to take my talent to the professional level? And I had a great senior season at Indiana State University and got an agent immediately after, trying out at one of the combines. And just through the process, I found out about a rule that FIBA had in place in regards to certain headgear. And this rule basically said you can't wear anything larger than an athletic headband. And so, after playing in the NCAA and getting a waiver to play and, kind of approve my religious attire, I was like, no problem. Like, I just played 4 years of college basketball, no questions asked. Let's tell them, I'm Muslim and this is what I practice. And when we, kind of let FIBA know, they responded saying they wanted to keep the game religiously neutral. And, I made a point that there are players with tattoos of their religious beliefs on their arms, whether it's a biblical scripture, whether it's Jesus, whatever, like, shouldn't they have to cover those up as well if we're talking about religious, neutrality, if you want to call it. Yeah. And so they basically knew that I kind of made a good point. And they said,
that is a good point.
They say, oh, well, your hijab is a safety hazard or a safety risk. And I'm like, wait, this is the softest piece of material. It had no pins in it. I didn't wear it wrapped around my neck. I tied it around my hair for that specific reason. After they said safety, never heard anything back. And that's when we kind of realized, you know what? I would have been the first Muslim woman to wear hijab in the pros. Is it discrimination? You know, so we were trying to see what I could do to potentially play. And when we were just trying to get to more, you know, talk to more people in FIBA, they cut off all communication. And so here I was with 3 months before I should have signed with the team overseas. Those 3 months went by fast. And I was faced with, you know, really, I was at a crossroad. And that's when I started to question things about myself, about my faith, and whether or not I should play without my hijab. So it was a tough time for me personally.
And I hear a little sound behind as well. So there you go.
Sorry.
No, it's perfect. It's what's made this whole COVID world so beautiful is we realize we have lives outside of work, right? Kids, pets, what have you. And I certainly hope as we come on the other side of the pandemic and God willing soon, that we remember these lessons, right? Of what truly matters is the human connection and people. And, you know, to all your points, as Jason said, be the leader we wish we had, right? Don't be so quick to judge. To Kenna's point as well, you know, if you have the privilege, be sure to have a seat at the table and a voice for those that may not. And then to your point, Bilqis, starting with each one of us, we have to be the change we wish to see in the world, right? We have to start with educating ourselves. And then the ripple effect of that over time will certainly be the tipping point. So this is just the beginning. I am very, very grateful to all three of you. For those of you watching, please look them up online, connect with them. I know Kenna is not on social media, but at least connect with him via email or look them up. Educate yourself on the resources we're sharing as well through today and going forward. And together, let's make a dent in the universe.
We are here with the Atlanta Dream's Elizabeth Williams, and we have had a development here. The players initially thought they would play tonight, but they have changed their mind, and Elizabeth Williams would like to read this statement.
After speaking with representatives from teams playing tonight, as well as our WNBPA leadership, the consensus is to not play in tonight's slate of games, and to kneel, lock arms, and raise fists during the national anthem. We stand in solidarity with our brothers in the NBA, and will continue this conversation with our brothers and sisters across all leagues and look to take collective action. What we have seen over the last few months, and most recently with the brutal police shooting of Jacob Blake, is overwhelming. And while we hurt for Jacob and his community, we also have an opportunity to keep the focus on the issues and demand change. These moments are why it's important for our fans to stay focused, hear our voices, know our hearts, and connect the dots from what we say to what we do.
The confident leader you see in that video was not always the bold, outspoken leader you see before you. My journey to that moment started as a shy, British-born daughter of Nigerian immigrants. My parents were born and raised in Nigeria. My dad is a doctor, mom's a nurse, Grey's Anatomy-esque, if you will. I was born in the UK, and after a few years there, we moved to the US. Any child of immigrants knows that failure was not an option, that grit and hard work is the standard. And I lived by that. I kept my head in the books and focused on not much else. That is, until basketball came along. Neither of my parents played basketball. Soccer was the sport. But when I got too tall for soccer, the idea of basketball came up. I started playing and fell in love with the game. As I got more serious with basketball, the immigrant upbringing kicked in. Education cannot suffer. Schoolwork first, basketball second, no room for much else. Activism honestly wasn't even a thought. Leadership, sure, but activism, I never wanted to stir up any trouble. My parents came to this country to make sure my siblings and I would have the best possible life, and I was afraid of doing anything to disrupt that. And I ended up choosing Duke University, and that experience was the beginning of a shift in my perspective. I started to learn what words like vulnerability and empathy truly meant and why they were so important. It was like learning a new language. Seeds were being planted, but for what? I didn't know at the time. I began to embrace leadership roles, both on and off the court. I represented student athletes in meetings and led a student athlete Bible study. However, when representatives from Athlete Ally stopped by to speak to student athletes, it was the perfect opportunity to speak up, to support, to be an ally to the LGBTQ community and athletes. I didn't do it. I couldn't do it. Allyship involves stepping outside of yourself, and I was still living in my box. School, basketball, with some leadership sprinkled in. But still, no activism or advocacy. I graduated from Duke in 2015 with a greater appreciation for outspoken leaders, but still didn't see myself as one. But then I entered the WNBA, and wow, professionalism, advocacy, allyship, empathy, all of what I'd started to see in college but never acted on. So in 2016, after the death of Philando Castile and the deaths of Black men from police brutality and systemic racism, WNBA players led a protest where they wore Black Lives Matter shirts and knelt during the national anthem. While my colleagues were on the front lines, I didn't participate. I admired from afar. I was nearly starstruck by my peers like Maya Moore, Tina Charles, Leja Clarendon, Neko Gwumike, and many others. I simply defended their actions, but did not stand alongside them. And similarly, I didn't think much about how to make massive changes politically. So fast forward to 2020. We're in a global pandemic. I'm at home in quarantine in Atlanta because my overseas season was canceled. Then I turn on the news, and what do I see? Not Black lives, but Black deaths, constantly, from COVID-19 and from a racist system. 3 names were on repeat in my head: Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. This moment felt different from 2016. I'd spent a few years on our union's executive committee, so my role in the league had changed. The pandemic forced everyone to look inward, and humans had nothing but time and media. Social media was everything, and we saw a new wave in the social justice movement. These issues had always existed, but the pandemic forced us to truly see and feel them. For me, these images were powerful enough for me to attend my first ever protest. Being physically in a space where the emotions of the movement were juxtaposed with heavy police presence was intimidating but necessary. So once we learned that the WNBA would still go on in the form of a bubble, or as we like to call it, the wubble, player leadership decided that this moment in history could not be lost. COVID safety was the #1 priority, but social justice was just as important. We dedicated the season to #SayHerName, to bring a voice to the women whose lives had been lost to police brutality and negligence. We shared stories about these women. We had conversations with their families. We wore t-shirts, and the proceeds from their sales went to organizations on the ground like the African American Policy Forum. We were on a mission. But then something else happened. One of our Atlanta Dream's former owners denounced the Black Lives Matter movement and the organization in a letter to our league commissioner. She said we needed to keep politics out of sports. It was a gut punch to my team and to WNBA players, but not for long. We did what we normally do. We spoke, we planned, and we strategized. What better way to strategically combat these words while simultaneously doubling down on our movement than moving into politics? In all these killings, people realized that positions like DAs and mayors, who are largely responsible for implementing justice, were elected officials. Our team owner was a U.S. Senator up for election, so why not look into who's running in her seat? This movement wasn't about a single person. This was about creating effective change. This movement wasn't about Black versus white. It was about creating a world where your Blackness doesn't hinder you and your whiteness doesn't put you at an advantage. Our intent wasn't to guilt white people into making changes. It was about creating advocacy and allyship. We proceeded to use our resources, people like Lisa Borders and Stacey Abrams, to find someone running in that Senate seat, whose policies align with those of our league's players. It happened to be Reverend Raphael Warnock. Our strategy started to move from strictly social justice into politics and voting. So in August, when we learned of the news of Jacob Blake's shooting, we found ourselves in a unique position, and I found myself right in the center of it. Our team was scheduled to play a nationally televised game at 7 p.m., but the Milwaukee Bucks had just announced that they weren't going to play in protest of that Kenosha, Wisconsin shooting. Initially, players started to warm up like normal, but as the Washington Mystics arrived, an important conversation was needed. Players throughout the league gathered on the court and had a conversation. Do we play or not? If not, why? How do we make sure that this single moment is not just that? one moment. We needed a plan. We agreed that this moment was bigger than basketball, and we shouldn't play. But additionally, the next day would be a day to reflect on all of the social justice work that we'd done. It would also be a time to mentally refresh as we were around the midpoint of being in the wubble. We made sure all eligible players were registered to vote and started to shift our conversation to a more political one. Get Out the Vote initiatives began, and those would ultimately carry our work as we transitioned out of the wubble. Playoff teams wore vote shirts, a clear reminder that even if the season was ending, our work was only beginning. So as one champion was crowned, we were still waiting for one more important result, the 2020 election. Players partnered with organizations like More Than a Vote, volunteered as poll workers, and more. Our calls for social justice always required action. And guess what? We did that. Our actions ultimately resulted in the flipping of the now infamous Senate seat, leading to the first ever Black senator from the state of Georgia, the state of John Lewis. A group of just 144 women made the decision that our actions would speak louder than words. While individual voices can make some change, our collective voices made the enormous change. Those who are normally quiet like me were emboldened to speak up. You can't force activism, but once you know what is right, your authenticity will drive you to do some amazing things. Don't let anyone tell you that your voice doesn't matter. Your voice matters, your vote matters, you matter.